This week, we got two early data points for the 2024 election that at first look don't seem like they make sense together. Tuesday was an election day, and across the country, Democrats continued their string of victories in state and local contests. Democratic Governor Andy Beshear was reelected in Kentucky. Ohio voters backed abortion rights, and Democrats took full control of the state legislature in Virginia. There were a lot of good signs for the Democratic Party. Just a few days earlier, though, the New York Times and Siena College released a new poll of battleground states, and it didn't look good for the Biden campaign. Trump was leading in 5 out of the 6 states where voters were surveyed, and support for Biden had fallen since 2020, especially among key groups in the party's coalition, like young people and Black voters. A bad poll on Sunday for the president, and a good night on Tuesday for his party. That can seem in conflict in terms of what it means for 2024. But one theory explains them both. While Democrats are doing better on a grassroots level, Biden has unique weaknesses with the electorate on a national level, mainly his age. So last week, just ahead of Election Day and the release of the poll, I traveled to Wilmington, Delaware, to hear firsthand from the Biden campaign. What's the case for Biden 2024? And what's their plan to win over a skeptical country? From the New York Times, I'm Ested Herndon. This is The Run-Up. Can you just tell us where we are?
We are in Wilmington, Biden HQ.
Biden HQ.
Biden HQ.
I have this very Biden-y sign behind you. Can you read it for me just for the sound?
Together we can finish the job.
It feels like an encapsulation of what I might be hearing from you coming up, huh?
You may hear it once or twice.
Quentin Folks is the second in command of the Biden campaign, principal deputy campaign manager to Julie Chavez Rodriguez. He's also a veteran of Democratic politics. Most recently, he managed Senator Raphael Warnock's successful campaign in Georgia. I wanted to pose this question to you kind of directly in the abstract. Like, a year out, let's hear the pitch. Why should Americans vote for the Biden-Harris ticket again in 2024?
Americans should vote for the Biden-Harris ticket again in 2024 because President Biden and Vice President Harris have kept their word. They have delivered for the American people, creating nearly 14 million jobs, going after Big Pharma to cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month, creating jobs, fixing roads and bridges, right? Really focusing on the things, as I said, that really matter to voters in the grand scheme of things and not trying to wage war on people's freedoms and their rights, right? For giving people more freedoms. And with time, which is what this campaign is asking for, to send them back to finish the job so that they can double down on that, right? It remains in stark contrast to what's on the other side and the alternative that's being proposed to us from the Republican Party, which is an extreme MAGA agenda that's focused on, providing tax breaks to corporations and the ultra wealthy and taking people's rights away.
Mm-hmm. I hear kind of 3 prongs in that. I hear both an argument that you all have made significant accomplishments in the White House in the first term, an argument to finish the job, as the big sign says behind you, in the second term, but also a kind of stark choice between Republicans that even outside of that work, that you all think if you stack up Biden next to the other options, that's a preference that comes back to you. Is that fair in terms of understanding how you're laying that out?
Yeah, I think it's completely fair. And I think that that's the one thing that I always try to, center everybody onto, that is elections are a choice. And we know that. But it is not a choice between Joe Biden and 300 million people. It's a choice between Joe Biden and the alternatives that the Republicans are putting forth and the agenda that they're putting forward. And that's the contrast that we're drawing. And I think is going to be front and center of this election for Americans to make that decision.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. One of the things I wanted to do is tick through some of the concerns we've heard from Democrats. The first is kind of just an overall apathy, just an idea that having a prospect of a rematch of 2020 left people feeling like they didn't want to deal with politics. They don't want to get involved. We see people being less engaged in kind of political systems than they were 4 years ago. What does a campaign do to speak to someone who feels that the system is not responsive to them in the abstract? And that's their kind of barrier for voting.
Well, look, I think that on one hand, I would challenge the idea that people are less engaged, right? I think when we're running a campaign and when you're looking at a campaign, what you're thinking about are some of the key metrics, and especially being a year out, you're focused on not what people are saying, but what they're actually doing. And if we look at the elections that have taken place thus far in 2023, and even coming off of 2022, we see people turning out to vote for, issues that aren't even about candidates, right? Ballot referendums, right? So I think that people are engaged and paying attention to this. Another metric that you really pay attention to when it comes to campaigning is fundraising. And we see a swell of grassroots support. But I will level with you. Campaigns are about communicating to people, what you're going to do with them. And so this campaign is really focused on that, which is why we're excited to be up on air, communicating with voters. Constituency-based media really targeted at Black and Hispanic voters very early out, right? Demonstrating that we're not going to parachute in the last minute and say, hey, please vote for us when we haven't done anything to earn that.
Yeah, and I hear the fundraising kind of metrics, and I hear the special election metrics that I think are certainly true. You've seen Democrats come out in races and state locally, as you mentioned, but I also see approval ratings being low. I also see high numbers of Democrats saying they're not sure they want Biden to run again, that they have interest in other options. What do you think is not translating between the accomplishments you're laying out here and what we do see people report kind of consistently, which is a desire for maybe a wider Democratic array of candidates?
Well, look, what I think you might be getting at is polls when you talk about what people are saying. And, what we say to polls is that's not how you win campaigns. That's not what we wake up every day thinking about a specific poll number, thinking about what we're going to message or not message, what we're going to have the president or the vice president do based on any particular poll. When it comes down to it, this far out, what this campaign is focused on and what we're doing to address the question that you're asking is communicating with voters. And this is the type of work and infrastructure that needs to be built. And I know this from being in a state like Georgia, in a battleground state, running a successful Senate campaign and having these same notions thrown at us. But at the end of the day, you have to be disciplined about what you are trying to do and what you're trying to say to voters and not come off of that.
Mm-hmm. The two other specific concerns we hear, downstream from kind of overall system concerns are foremost about age. To the voters who are concerned that President Biden is simply too old, not that he has been a bad president, but that the next 4 years, they are uncomfortable by the specific question of age. What does the campaign say to that?
I mean, I would say to those voters, and I think that regardless of the age of those voters or the race or the geographical differences of those voters, I would say that at the end of the day, people don't care when you're lowering their healthcare costs or making things in their lives more affordable if that's being given to them by somebody that's 80 or by somebody that's 25. And at the end of the day, people care about kitchen table issues. And I think a lot of that stuff is beltway chatter that is from people who are out of touch and really don't know what voters actually care about. And again, that's why this campaign remains focused on continuing to double down and relay those messages about the accomplishments of this administration and the wisdom that comes along with President Biden's age is exactly and precisely what we need at this moment to get things done.
Mm-hmm. We also hear concerns about Vice President Harris. I saw the campaign and the kind of early advertisements really been featuring her more prominently. Is it an explicit work of this campaign to pitch Harris in a way that reingratiates her with the American people?
I don't think that we're re-ingratiating the vice president. I think that we're pointing out the vice president's records of accomplishments alongside the president of the United States as any campaign would. And, this is one of my favorite things because, again, I'm trying to think of another word besides beltway chatter or bedwetting.
Yeah, it's all good.
But at the end of the day, people need to knock this off because if you really want to know about the vice president, what you should look at is the drove of young students coming out when she's on HBCUs or college campuses. And the vice president is a great campaigner and an asset to this ticket and this administration, and we're going to proceed to use her as such.
I guess I'm not asking about age or Vice President Harris because of polls. I want to be clear. I'm asking it because we hear from people about those things. Is it minimizing to call it beltway chatter only? Are these the real concerns of real voters?
I mean, again, I think that we see the concerns when people are showing up. Like, are these things that are being said while she's on these college campuses mobilizing these young students, right? And at the end of the day, we are not focused on what people are saying. Mm-hmm. We're focused on what people are doing and the metrics that we are looking at, because I hear you, but what we're focused on are the metrics that we're looking at and the support that she gets when she's out there talking about the issues that matter to constituencies that we know resonate with her.
You mentioned kind of early investment in Black and Latino turnout specifically. What does that look like a year from now? Because to your point, we do hear over and over from these communities how they feel left behind until close to Election Day. So what is the work that's happening right now so that feeling is not true for those folks?
Yeah, and this is something that's very personal for me. This is something that, I feel like we were really able to do very effectively in Georgia during my time as Senator Warnock's manager. And then you know this, but or maybe you do. I'm sort of putting that on you just as us both being Black men. But there's often this assumption that, when we don't turn out to vote, we being collective African Americans, not that I speak for all of them, but it's somehow our fault, but we aren't being communicated with. And so what Julie and I have come into this campaign in the forefront is saying, no, this is the base of the Democratic Party, and we have to communicate with these voters. That started through television and constituency media with validators that look like these communities, speaking in language to these communities, whether it be in print, digital, television. Also,
I want to detangle this earlier investment in these communities with more people who look like these communities before the campaigns were typically doing that.
Yes, more before any campaign in history has started communicating with these base constituency voters. The Biden-Harris campaign is doing that because we recognize it, and we're sending a clear signal that this campaign is not going to wait until August of next year, October of next year, to parachute in and say, what are you doing? So in political operative terms, we're not treating these base voters, Black and Hispanic AAPI voters, like GOTV targets, get out the vote targets. We're treating them as persuadable targets that we need to communicate our message and what this administration has done so that they know how important they are to our victory and success in 2024. The other piece, I think, in regards to reaching people is being in their communities and organizing. That's something that is traditionally not done in Black and brown communities that I think is there. And the other thing is thinking about campaigns as economic entities themselves that people of color often feel left out of. And I think that this campaign is going to do the work of making sure that that doesn't happen this time around, and I'm extremely proud of that.
What does that mean? You're talking about staffing? You're talking about
it means staffing. It means when we're on the ground hiring people from the communities, right? I'm not going to take a set of organizers from Wisconsin and throw them on the ground in Georgia and have them knock doors. I'm going to hire folks in Georgia who believe in the Biden-Harris administration and have them knock doors in their communities because it matters more, right? We have to take all these things into account. And that's, you may hear different versions or terms for this, but that's what relational organizing is, right? Folks who have some type of relation to a community organizing it, right? Whether I don't know what you're into, but if you play cards and you have a poker group, right? Those people that you play poker with are probably more likely to hear you when you say, hey, this is what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been doing, more than they are some stranger that we send. So, right, we're really starting from scratch and really revamping the way that we're communicating with people, and I'm really excited about that.
There seems to be a big change in how people receive information from when we think about 2019, 2020 until now. What is the campaign doing to meet people where they are on that front, and how is that different in 2024 versus Biden in 2020?
Well, look, I will say that this is the fun stuff, and I actually like talking about this stuff. But I will say,
did you not like talking about the previous stuff?
Well, I like talking about it all, but this is the weedier stuff that I could be a little bit of, of a political operative and a nerd
out
on.
For us.
But look, in 2020, I wasn't there, and so I don't want to critique. It's also hard to critique a campaign that got 80 million votes. But what I will say is that the media environment is fragmented, and at any day, a kid unboxing Legos on YouTube has more reach than a presidential campaign. That's something that we have to acknowledge and that we have to accept in today's environment. There are also more apps, more communication, more podcasts that people are getting their news from than ever before. And so what that means for us is that the campaign has to be very specific in how we're targeting them. And when we talk about laying the infrastructure and doing the work beforehand, that's another way that we're judging success.
Parties have issues they want the election to be about. And, Republicans will have a set of issues that they're trying to refocus the election on. What is the set of issues that this campaign wants voters to be thinking about in the voting booth in 2024? And, I hear people mention freedoms. Does that mean abortion rights? Is that what we're talking about there?
Yeah, I mean, okay. I think it's all encompassing, but really, economy. And I don't want to, sort of capitalize on the entire time that we have together. But when it comes to the economy, President Biden and Vice President Harris are focused on lowering costs for the American people, while Republicans are trying to give tax breaks to corporations and the wealthy, right? But then when you get into that freedom argument, it's about abortion. It's about whitewashing history and trying to erase things that we know have happened. It's about voting rights. It's about standing up to the NRA while, kids in America these days only know how to duck and hide when they hear loud pops, right? This is the contrast that we're drawing, and these are the issues that we care about. But look, we are not going to make the mistake of trying to lump everybody together. Everybody doesn't have to care about the same issues. But it's this campaign's job, and that's some of the work that we're doing in this infrastructure lane period too, is identifying these issues that resonate most. And that doesn't mean that, you can't be an African-American man and care about abortion. I deeply care about abortion. But it does mean that there may be something else that you care about. And once we identify that, those are the messages that we're going to create to you. But the best part about my job and the best part about anybody that's working for Biden-Harris 2024 is that pretty much across the board, regardless of what that issue is, President Biden and Vice President Harris have probably done something on it to deliver for the American people. And that is a dream for a campaign manager.
When I hear those issues, when I think about the economy, whether it's abortion rights, or even I think about back to 2020 with the pandemic or with the racial justice protest after George Floyd's murder, those are really domestic focus. One thing that's obviously come up more this year, and I think particularly in the last month, is a focus on kind of global conflicts. We have what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. You have what's happening in Israel, Gaza. And there's been increasing calls from young people specifically to try to push the Democratic Party to embrace things like a ceasefire. How does Biden deal with an election next year that may not be on the traditional issues that are more domestic focused, but might be on the more intertwined global conflict where there's less cohesion among the Democratic, I would say, collective?
Look, I think that, these are foreign policy issues and they're very complex. What I will say is that personally, in my belief, and I think a lot of people, is that there's nobody better than President Biden that understands the complexity of these issues. And his leadership in these moments is another stark contrast to what we're seeing. When it comes to Israel and Palestine, Gaza, and the things that are going on over there, I think the president has been very clear about where he is, which is, Israel has the right to defend itself, in the aftermath of this terrorist attack. Two, the way in which they do that and conduct themselves while they're doing that really matters here. And three, there needs to be humanitarian aid to Gaza. And I think he's been forcefully pushing for that. So I think it's pivotally important that the White House is communicating to constituencies on both sides of this issue, because we don't view this as a political issue for the campaign. People are dying, right? We understand that, and we understand the veracity of thought and passion behind it on both sides. And so I want to make clear that is taken seriously. But if we look at what's on the other side of the aisle here, which again, going back to the central premise of this, elections are a choice.
Yeah.
And it's Joe Biden versus the extreme Republican agenda on the other side. These are the basics and the facts that American voters are going to have in front of them when they decide who they want to touch that screen or pull that lever for in 2024.
Yeah, I guess when I think about this issue, and I think it relates to young people largely, when we talk to the folks, that choice isn't necessarily between Biden or who is on the other side, but sometimes a choice, I think when we think about more liberal young folks, between Biden and not voting at all, right? And saying that it's not as if they would back Donald Trump, but it's a choice between whether they are going to lend themselves to Joe Biden. What, I guess, specifically speaks to the person who feels like communities aren't changing, who feels like there's a shared agreement between DNR and not much changes their community either way? I'm saying, is there a response to get that person off the couch? Not necessarily that choice.
I think for me, this is one of those issues that's personal, because I hear it a lot even within my own community and to constituencies, that relate to me. And, I'm talking about Black men not voting. And I'm not saying that Black men don't vote. I'm not just putting that, but I'm saying this personal to me as a Black man.
I think, but we're both Black men. I'm saying to that group specifically, it often feels like a choice between voting, not voting.
I hear it, but not voting loses progress. Not voting loses progress. Not voting is why we have affirmative action overturned. Not voting, and that's not on any one constituency's fault, but it's a cumulative thing. We're all in this together. In the effects of not voting, that's not an option for trying to make the world a better place for what you want to hear. And there is a constituency of voters out there that we will have to make that case to. And so not, discrediting your question or even the honesty behind the question itself, because there is a voters out there. And for those voters who feel like it's less between a choice of voting for Joe Biden or a choice of not voting at all, the alternative still remains the same in either of those scenarios, right? So regardless, to me, I hear you making the distinction of somebody not voting versus coming out and voting for Donald Trump. The effects
Somebody's
of
going to be
both
president.
are cumulative.
Yeah. You're making a clear case for the kitchen table and you all having an advantage in being able to speak to those issues. But I kind of wonder if the issues on the table have changed. Like, we talked about economy, we've talked about the kind of more traditional things, the possibility of foreign policy being a bigger deal next year. I think about President Trump's legal issues and how much space that's going to take up in 2024. The prospect of him being in a courtroom for months on end by the time we get to Election Day. Is the Joe Biden campaign going to speak to that when it comes?
I think the president has been very clear that we're going to let the judicial system do what the judicial system is supposed to do. And again, going back to it, if Donald Trump is the nominee that we are facing, I think that this campaign, in face of questions like this, may draw out the contrast once again that is the difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Donald Trump would interfere in elections. Donald Trump would talk about these cases. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are focused on the work of what they can get done for the American people. That's what our message is, and nothing's going to change that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
The next day, back in New York, I got an early look at the Times polling numbers, which have since been released publicly. And when you look past the top lines and dig into the specifics, it painted an even bleaker picture of the president's challenges with his base than the one I'd brought to the Biden campaign. In the poll, voters under 30 preferred Biden by only a single percentage point. His lead among Hispanic voters was down to single digits. And Black voters, who have long been the Democratic Party's most loyal constituency group, were registering 22% support for Donald Trump, historically high for a Republican in a presidential race. So while Biden has generally performed well with independent or swing voters, like the ones we talked to last week in Washington State's Clallam County, his biggest problems are within his own party, at least according to these recent polls. The conditions reminded me of the 2016 presidential election, when Democrats underrated the electorate's distaste for Hillary Clinton and paved the way for Trump to get into office the first time. So I wanted to take the same questions I asked to Quentin Folks and pose them to a different Democratic strategist, one that's not with the official Biden campaign, and could speak more directly to the topics the campaign might rather avoid. Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you so much for connecting with us. We appreciate it.
Well, I'm sorry it was such a shit show to connect. I very much apologize.
No, it's really... So I called Jim Messina.
I'm CEO of the Messina Group. I was campaign manager for Barack Obama's re-election campaign.
The campaign manager for Barack Obama's re-election campaign in 2012. I wanted to talk to Messina because he knows Democratic politics. He helped re-elect an incumbent. And his methods help pioneer the way campaigns use data now to understand the electorate. Yesterday, we were out in Wilmington, Delaware, talking to the Biden campaign team, and they presented a pretty clear view of how they were seeing the re-election. And, it was kind of more traditional focused. They were laying out an election in 24 that's going to be about an incumbent and his accomplishments, about the strength of the economy, and about things like, Republican attempts to take abortion rights away from voters. I guess I wanted to ask you, as someone who has been involved in things like this and who has been an innovator on that kind of landscape, do you think that's the issue set that is going to be top of mind come next year?
I do, but part of why I love data is I think we just ought to follow it. I stood up in this meeting in D.C. before the Dobbs decision, and everyone was like, all elections are economic elections. Jim, you agree. You always say it's economic elections. And I said, yeah, I've said that for a very long time, but that's not what the data says. Everyone's like, what do you mean? And I said, the data says that women are absolutely angry about the Dobbs decision and what's going to happen if they overturn this. And we just ought to follow the data. And that led the Democrats to doing more ads about abortion in the midterms than they did economics. And so I think those things are true. And the truth is, we just ought to follow the data. I think that's what the data says right now. But, let's let it lead us to the avenue of the truth.
When you say data, are you talking about, kind of mass info? Are you talking about polling? Like, where is the data set that really, makes up how campaigns make their decisions?
Well, it is a great question. So I'm a huge believer that polling is broken and that polling sucks. And especially this far out. I'm not saying polling's terrible in every case, but this far out, polling is historically wrong. So I don't think polling is the only way. I'm a huge believer in social listening, seeing what people are saying online, taking mass data sets. I'm a huge believer in getting as much historical data about people and what they can do and what they can use. Both parties collect several hundred pieces of data on every voter and attempt to use that for modeling purposes. So when I say data, I say all of it. But if you had to say to me, Jim, pick one, I would pick online social media metadata as the way to figure out what people are saying.
Partly why I ask is because, we took to the Biden campaign some of the concerns that I think our data shows us. And the top concern we hear, from voters, I think both who are Democrats thinking about the incumbent president and people who I would consider independents or more swing types, has been about the president's age, an issue that the White House, doesn't speak to as much directly, but is clearly on the minds of kind of regular people. I wanted to take that to you because when we went to the campaign, they were pretty confident that that issue would not be the priority for voters come next year. They kind of framed it like, yeah, they'll say it to journalists right now. They'll say it to pollsters right now. But we think come election day, this won't actually be what is top of mind for people. Is that what the data says right now?
No, what the data says right now is it's absolutely an issue. But I think part of why I love politics is it's a combination of art and science. And I think if you just look at it now, you'd say age is the biggest issue and, Biden's in deep trouble. But I don't think that's really true. I don't think that's how it plays out. I just don't think next year is likely to be as important. And I'm not trying to spin you. I really believe that my 25 years in politics teaches me voters care about themselves. They don't care about Joe Biden. They don't care about Donald Trump. They want to know what's in it for them and how these two candidates are going to make their life better. And that's how they view this. And age becomes an issue if they believe that those candidates aren't in it for them and aren't making their life better. But eventually they're going to sit back and say, hey, who's going to make my life better?
Okay, that still requires the election kind of being fought on more traditional grounds. And I guess I'm saying if you're the campaign, if you're Biden, how do you message the issue in such a way where voters don't make it top of mind? Do you have to address it? Or do you think that it's just going to be a natural transition where come election day, they'll be prioritizing other things?
Oh, look, I think you absolutely have to address it. I think
how do you address it? Yeah, I guess that's why I'm asking.
Well, so I do not advise the Biden campaign. I'm happily retired, but I would do it. I would do it three ways. One, with humor, and he jokes about it now, which I think is super good.
Yeah, it seems like new. It seems like a kind of new thing that he's been doing these type of jokes.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think he's very smart to do it. The second thing is, embrace it and make it a plus. He has wisdom. In the middle of all these wars, in the middle of all this stuff, having a guy who's been around and understands this was partially how he won last time, right? His argument to the American public was, I know how to do this and I'm not crazy and I'll be calm. Well, that's all true. So wisdom really matters. But then the third thing is, I think the comparison between the two next year is going to be super important. It is going to be important to have a debate. The country is going to want to see both of them. And if that's an actual debate, I think it's pretty clear Trump will never agree to debate. But people will be back and forth between the two of them, looking at both of them, and they'll make their own judgments. Voters are so much smarter than people give them credit for.
Yeah, I know that both you and the Biden folks we talked to yesterday are hammering the point that I think we should be clear about, that this is a year out, so we should take all polls with a grain of salt. But, I was just talking to Nate Cohn, our Times pollster today, and he, said some things that really stuck with me about, like, when you look at the arc of kind of Democratic incumbents and presidents and their relationship to the base, that he's currently seeing some of the worst numbers he's ever seen in terms of like Black voters, Latino voters, particularly folks who only vote in presidential elections, people who aren't the kind of super voter type. I guess I want to ask kind of clearly, like Like for a Biden campaign, for kind of Democratic apparatus, those numbers aren't concerning?
Oh, they are. Like your job as campaign manager of the President of the United States is to wake up every day worrying. When I ran Obama's campaign, Obama saw my then girlfriend, now wife, at a rally. And she goes, Mr. President, you look great. And he said, do you know why I look great? And she goes, no, I don't. And he goes, because I paid Jim to worry and Jim looks terrible. And so your job is to worry about that stuff. And I think Team Biden is I give them credit for one thing, and you know this. They're out right now advertising to African American,
Yeah.
Latino, and young audiences. Barack Obama didn't do that. And they're not doing turnout ads. They are saying, let me talk to you about the issues. And I think that is them saying, we have some challenges. And instead of bearing their head up, they're spending, like, I could not believe how much money they spent in the last report on persuasion to, Black, brown, and young voters. And I think it's exactly the right decision.
Young voters have been such a kind of mythic group about like how much do these young voters matter and how much should Democrats take concerns of young voters seriously. When you see numbers from Quinnipiac that say, 80% of people under 35, support humanitarian aid to Palestinians or 65% oppose more military aid to Israel. Like, should that be a concern for President Biden that on such a big issue set, he seems kind of out of line with what he's getting from the youngest base of the party?
So in 2020, Joe Biden won because of historic turnout with young voters, right? There was more young voter turnout than for Hillary Clinton 4 years before. And so those numbers are really important. And part of the concern for Democrats is, can they get young voter turnout the way they did last time? And you would look at those numbers currently, and it would be a concern. Biden needs huge young turnout. And there is sort of this theory of the case in the Democratic Party that, it's like 2020. They're going to turn out because they hate Donald Trump and he's anathema to them. I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that will help. I think abortion will really help because that group of voters looks at this and says, oh my God, I'm going to spend 40 years with these draconian laws. But I think you need to make a positive case too.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this kind of base enthusiasm point is really where a lot of the kind of lag in polls is coming from. He continues to do well among the kind of swing voters, independents that find Trump distasteful, but it's about shoring up those young people, about shoring up Latino voters and Black voters specifically, who are not great signs for them in the midterm elections. It seems as if so much of that 2020 proposition was because, as you said, Trump was seen as an existential threat that those folks kind of had to consolidate at the end of the day. I mean, it does kind of feel like they're shaping up to give a similar message on the threat to democracy. Is there been enough of that positive case you're identifying? Has that come through at this point to young people, to Black voters?
I think the answer is probably not, which is why they're spending money on it, right? And I think that's true with another really crucial group of people, which are swing women voters in the suburbs. You can't just assume you're going to say the word abortion and have it be okay. You got to give them positive things to hold on to, especially economic. I mean, we're still, way far out here. And so they've got to do more. And I think that's why their early spending is so much earlier than anyone's ever done it before.
The last couple questions I have, one of which are about like the other looming issue when I think about 2024, which is Trump's indictments. I mean, This is not something the campaign is touching. I mean, we asked them yesterday. They make really clear, as the president has said, they're going to leave this up to the Justice Department. But when we talk to voters, that's huge on their kind of understanding of next year. There's the real possibility that Donald Trump could spend months on end in a courtroom and totally change maybe the nature of the race. If you are the Biden campaign, are you planning for that? And how do you plan for that, even if they can't tell us about that now?
Right now, they've got to just be focused on talking to both their base and swing voters about what he's done over and over and over. And, there used to be this phrase in American politics, when your opponent's drowning, don't throw him a lifeline. And so why would they start talking about it in the middle of all this, right? Like, they have to drive a positive message right now, every day, all day. And that's what they're doing. And the problem with Donald Trump is he's sort of like free beer. It's so easy to hit him every day. You could do nothing but hit Donald Trump every day because he says something crazy every day if you're a Democrat.
That's interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. You're like, this right now is the time that they should be focused, as they're doing with those early investments, about shoring up the base, about getting the kind of positive message out there. And then when we look at towards next year, when there could be a more specific general election matchup, or when this is more directly in the news, do you think we can expect to hear the Biden campaign talk about it then?
1,000%. What's the highest percentage you have in your pod? Like, yeah, of course. Um, but again, hopefully not every day. And the truth is, if you just, look at the Trump challenge for a second, he's going to have the nomination wrapped up on March 5th, and then he's going to spend the spring and the summer in court. And right when these same voters you and I just talked about are starting to pay attention. And, we've never gone through that.
Right.
We've like, this is just uncharted territory. None of my fancy, sophisticated models can predict what happens when the guy's in court the whole summer.
One thing that is the last thing I'll ask you, which has been bugging me like all year, is like, we have been doing this since the midterms. And one thing that has been consistent since that time is the people who don't want both of these options for 2024. People who have been saying to us over and over how much they would like another option. And I found it really interesting how the Biden campaign has been able to clear the field to really make that possible. I'm wondering if you found that interesting, and how exactly do campaigns create that type of, what does it mean to clear the field? Because it feels like that was such an important thing that happened this year, but it's kind of back room.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 2011 clearing the field for Barack Obama. Like,
what is that? What does that look like?
Like, so the people that might be, in our case, Bernie Sanders was thinking about running. And, we had a whole Bernie strategy. And the reason why you care, people might say, like, well, why do you care? And it is insanely hard as the incumbent president of the United States to have a primary where then you have to talk to your base for 6 months at the same time when these swing voters are trying to make up their mind. And it's just an impossible dance. And so Biden was able to avoid the primary for two really good reasons. The first is he was phenomenally successful in the first 2 years and got these historic things done. And you just had like real excitement. Second is we way overperformed what anyone thought we were going to do in the midterms. And people are like, whoa, Joe Biden was right about democracy when everyone gave him grief about it. Joe Biden was right about the abortion stuff when everyone gave him grief about it. And then he got all these things that Democrats love, like infrastructure and IRA and all that stuff. So there was never sort of the people that you would think would be likely potential primary people. There was just never any kind of groundswell for any of that. And that is super important.
It does. It feels like if that midterms went differently and we got even the red wave some expected, or even a not such a Democratic overperformance, that, there would have certainly been more chatter or more interest in some of those primary opponents. But, the reality that we live in was a consolidation around Biden, a change in the primary order, all of these things that really added up to really helping the incumbency. It does feel like a huge thing that happened this year that I feel like it sometimes gets glossed over.
Totally. It's underreported. I totally agree.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
There's another reason why I was pushing Jim Messina on this idea of clearing the field. Not just because it's something I've been thinking about for a while, but because of a new data point that came from the Times poll of battleground states. When asked, voters preferred a generic Democrat over Trump by 8 points, 48 to 40. Meaning any Democrat, however bland or unremarkable, could have a chance of defeating Trump, as long as they're not 80 years old. There's just one problem. That person would have to win a Democratic primary at this late stage and over the wishes of the Democratic establishment. To put it mildly, I was skeptical this could be done. But after talking to the Biden campaign and Messina, I decided to make one last call. Why are you running for president?
I'm running for president because if somebody doesn't replace President Biden and Vice President Harris on the Democratic ticket, we're going to see another Donald Trump presidency.
Because technically, the field isn't entirely clear for Biden. 2 weeks ago, a little-known Democratic congressman named Dean Phillips announced his candidacy at the last minute in New Hampshire. His message, despite voting consistently with the Biden administration, was that it was time for a change.
After 50 years in Washington, D.C., it's time for some change and people who have new ideas. So this is not a condemnation of the president. This is saying that he's going to lose the election because there's a culture of silence and getting in line and being quiet at a time we cannot afford that. So just 3 weeks ago, when it became very apparent that filing deadlines were approaching, that nobody was going to stand up, somebody had to. And if not then, when? And if not me, who?
You know, you're not someone who wants Donald Trump to be president, I imagine, right? Is there any concern that you're helping him get reelected by laying out differences you have with the administration that you did vote with 100% of the time?
No, they're not differences. I'm saying I voted for the policies I thought were compelling. Cornel West is hurting the president. That's the truth. I'm running in the primary because that's what we do in the United States to offer different ideas, in this case, generational change. That's how you do it. I'm not going to undermine him and condemn him or demean him. I'm going to be accretive to him. And by the way, if my campaign does not succeed, I will wrap it up with grace, and I will give the Biden campaign or whoever the eventual Democratic nominee is, I will give their campaign the same energy, passion, and focus that I'm giving my own, because we have got to win the next election.
Considering this late stage, right? Considering the fact that you are someone who has such a close record ideologically with the president. If you're a voter who at this stage has a choice between Joe Biden and someone who they don't know, who has trouble getting on the ballot, and who does not have a clear policy difference between the administration in the last 4 years, isn't it kind of a lot to ask someone to abandon that kind of known quantity for something that does feel some unknown? I guess I'm wanting a clear story on why you are asking those Democratic primary voters to do such a thing.
I'm glad you asked it that way. I'm not asking anybody to abandon anything. I'm simply fulfilling the appetite that is clearly reflected in all the numbers we're seeing, which is people want an alternative. If I'm the alternative...
You're saying they want it, so you might as well give it to them.
Yes, that's what we do in America. The absence of that, the absence of an alternative, the writing's on the wall. We're going to have another 4 years of Donald Trump. Read the crosstabs in yesterday's New York Times Siena poll. And let's say it's a generic Democrat against former President Trump. That generic Democrat is ahead 48-40.
Yeah. But
you asked the question. So what is more compelling than that? The fact of the matter is that if it is not President Biden and it's a generic, I never aspired to be generic, and I'm not generic, but I have to say, this is the only day in my life, perhaps, that I say, you know what? It ain't so bad being generic, because that's what the country, we could talk about this for hours upon hours. That's the number that matters. President Biden will lose to Trump, but Trump will lose to a generic Democrat. So right now, it's Marianne Williamson or Dean Phillips. I'm simply going to go around the country. It is not easy. It is ridiculously expensive and disenfranchising, but I will introduce myself. I will listen. I will answer people's questions. Our country, and this is really important, the president has done a good job governing a country that has been in crisis. He was a bridge, but he has not fulfilled the core objective of his promise to restore the soul of America. There are ways to do this, I think, in a magnificent way that it's time for a new generation to try, and I'm going to make that case. And look, if this white generic Democrat who's got a life experience that I can't wait to share with people and has empathy and strength is not the guy, so be it. But you know what? Let's at least give this a shot.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate you. Keep the faith, and thanks for having me on.
For the record, I asked the Biden campaign about Phillips too, and here's what they had to say. Something I just thought of is you now have a Democratic challenger who announced last week, Congressman Dean Phillips filed to run in New Hampshire. How does you're laughing? How does the Biden campaign think about their new opponent?
We thank Congressman Phillips for voting with the president nearly 100% of the time. So, we look forward, but President Biden is the Democratic nominee for president, and we're going to proceed as such and continue doing all the things that I've talked about in this podcast to make sure that we're reaching the American people.
It isn't phasing y'all.
We're focused on continuing to communicate our message to the American people.
Next week, an interview with the vice president. That's the run-up for Thursday, November 9th, 2023. And now, the rundown.
Abortion is healthcare. And abortion access is the law of the land in Ohio.
On Tuesday, voters turned out to protect abortion access in several states, like in Ohio, where nearly 57% of voters said yes on the new amendment to the state's constitution, securing the right to an abortion.
Let's turn to Virginia now.
And in Virginia,
Democrats will now control 2/3 of the state government and will be able to stymie GOP wish list items when it comes to abortion, guns, and voting rights.
Democrats kept control in the state Senate and picked up a new majority in the state House. That means Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin, who publicly called for a 15-week abortion ban in the state, won't have the votes to put it into law. And finally,
tonight, a critical test in the race for the White House.
Last night, 5 Republican candidates took to the stage for the third debate of the primary season.
The candidates ready to make their case.
Chris Christie, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Tim Scott.
He said Republicans were going to get tired of winning. Well, we saw last night, I'm sick of Republicans losing.
Right out the gate, the candidates attacked the primary frontrunner, not so subtly blaming Donald Trump for GOP losses on Tuesday.
Everybody wants to talk about President Trump. Well, I can talk about President Trump. I can tell you that I think he was the right president at the right time. I don't think he's the right president now.
Trump, who has a commanding lead in Republican primary polls, did not participate. There are 9 weeks and 4 days till the Iowa caucus, and 362 days, that's less than a year, till the general election. We'll see you next week. The Run-Up is reported by me, Ested Herndon, and produced by Elisa Gutierrez, Caitlin O'Keefe, and Anna Foley. It's edited by Rachel Dry, Lisa Tobin, and Franny Kartoff, with original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, Pat McCusker, Diane Wong, and Elishaba Itub. It was mixed by Sophia Landman and fact-checked by Caitlin Love. Special thanks to Paula Schumann, Sam Dolnick, Larissa Anderson, David Haufinger, Renan Borelli, Jeffrey Miranda, Kitty Bennett, and Maddie Masiello. If you like the show and want to get updates on the latest episodes, follow our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next week.